Cuban Missile Crisis nearly led to the ultimate death and destruction of the human race, through its revolution which changed the world, the reaction where the world lay stunned, and the reform that ended it all. The Cuban Missile Crisis truly revolutionized the Cold War. The Cold War was a continuing state of political and military confrontation between the Western world, led by the United States and its NATO allies, and the Communist world, led by the Soviet Union, its satellite states, and allies. The Cold War involved no direct military confrontation between the US and the USSR, up until the Cuban Missile Crisis, which transformed this into a hot war when conflict did occur and war nearly broke out. John F. Kennedy was the beloved American president at the time of the crisis. At his time, Cuban relations were extremely tense, as Fidel Castro had taken control of Cuba a few years back. This became a dangerous situation for the United States because the US was unsure whether or not Castro was a full communist or a revolutionary. The US feared the spread of communism throughout Latin America, and so the CIA launched an invasion of the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The mission failed, and Castro immediately turned to the USSR for support against future attacks. This is where Nikita Khrushchev steps in. Khrushchev was Soviet leader at the time of the crisis, and after Castro insisted the Soviet Union aid Cuba by arming them for defense against the United States, in the fall of 1962, he began deploying medium-range ballistic missiles to Cuba. Sergei Khrushchev explained to myself why he thought his father would place missiles in Cuba.
It was the simple rule in the Cold War. If you have some enemy of your enemy, you have to support him, but Soviet Union has no intention to go.
The Soviet Union began shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba. The US had been monitoring this increase in shipping activity to Cuba. On the 29th, a U-2 flight over Cuba revealed the presence of SA-2 SAM, or surface-to-air missile sites. Kennedy announced the presence of these missiles on September 4th. That same day, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin assured Attorney General Robert Kennedy that no offensive missiles would be placed in Cuba. Kennedy ordered another U-2 flight over Cuba. On October 14th, Major Richard Heiser flew over Cuba and snapped more than 3,000 photographs in only 12 minutes. October 15th. Analysts began poring over giant blow-ups of Heiser's photographs. October 16th. Kennedy, still in his pajamas that morning, was given the news by his National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. His reaction was pure astonishment, as Nikita Khrushchev had given him a personal pledge not to deploy offensive weapons into Cuba. The missiles had a range of 1,100 miles and threatened major population centers. Also that evening, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, assembled for the first time, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara outlined 3 possible courses of action against Cuba and the Soviet Union.
First is what I would call a political course of action. A second course of action is a course of action that would involve the declaration of open surveillance, a statement that we would immediately impose a blockade against offensive weapons entering Cuba in the future, and an indication that with our open surveillance reconnaissance, which we would plan to maintain indefinitely for the future, we would be prepared to immediately attack the Soviet Union in the event that Cuba made any offensive move against this country. But the third course of action is any one of these variants of military action directed against Cuba, starting with an air attack against the missiles.
One of Kennedy's biggest fears was retaliation in Berlin.
And you have to remember, when we talk about retaliation and the fear of the retaliation in Berlin, the Kennedy did not know that they had 96 tactical nuclear warheads at Cuba. It is enough power to retaliate about any invading force just on spot, and no need to retaliate in any other place.
October 17th. Throughout EXCOM's discussions, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were fixed on an airstrike. Later that night, another U-2 flight over Cuba revealed intermediate-range SS-5 nuclear missiles over Cuba, which could reach anywhere in the continental United States with the exception of Washington and Oregon. October 18th. Kennedy fulfilled a previously scheduled meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko continued to argue that the missiles were solely for defensive purposes. The EXCOM meeting held later that evening ended up with some results, as the majority agreed a blockade would be the best option. Kennedy liked the idea of a blockade. because it gave the Soviets a way out of the crisis. October 19th. Before leaving for a trip to the Midwest, Kennedy asked his brother Robert Kennedy to draw up 2 full scenarios for both the blockade and the airstrike. October 20th. After XCOM finalized the 2 speeches, Kennedy returned to Washington. Roswell Gilpatrick summed up Kennedy's 2 options, being limited and unlimited action. Kennedy decided limited action in the form of a blockade. October 21st. After a brief meeting, Kennedy finalizes the idea of a blockade. October 22nd. Military alert was raised to DEFCON 3. At 7:00 p.m., Kennedy gave his address to the nation on the crisis.
This government,
as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Khrushchev had received a copy of Kennedy's speech earlier in the day and was angry towards his military for not hiding the missiles and towards this quarantine, as it was an act of war. Castro mobilized all of Cuba's military forces. October 23rd. The Organization of American States, OAS, approved of the quarantine. Kennedy signed the actual proclamation of interdiction. U.S. ships had taken up position on the quarantine line 800 miles from Cuba. Later that evening, Robert Kennedy went to reprimand Dobrynin for lying to the United States about missiles in Cuba. His response? There were no offensive missiles in Cuba. October 24th. XCOM convened at 10:00 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the time the blockade began. XCOM could finally breathe a sigh of relief when they received news at 10:25 a.m. that the ships were turning back. Khrushchev did not wish to further expand the crisis by challenging the blockade. This did not mean the crisis was over, as the military alert was raised to DEFCON 2 that same day, the highest level ever in U.S. history. That evening, a second letter was received at the White House from Khrushchev. He stated that Soviet ships bound for Cuba would not stop at the American quarantine line. October 25th. Khrushchev received another letter from Kennedy stating that he would not back down. Kennedy sent Adlai Stevenson to the United Nations meeting to confront the Soviets about the missile sites in Cuba. When directly asked about these missile sites, Soviet Ambassador Zorn refused to comment, and so Stevenson showed the photographs of the missile sites. October 26th. During a meeting with ABC News correspondent John Scaley, Alexander Fomin, KGB station chief in Washington, proposed a solution to the crisis. The proposal was the dismantling of Soviet bases in Cuba in exchange for a pledge from the U.S. not to invade Cuba. Later that evening, another letter from Khrushchev asked the U.S. if they would accept the terms of Fomin's proposal to Scaley. October 27th, the worst day of the crisis yet. First, Major Rudolph Anderson's U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, the first and last casualty of the crisis. The second event that day was a much more demanding letter from Khrushchev. The demands were for Americans to take their missiles out of Italy and Turkey in exchange for those in Cuba. The president remained stuck, as losing the missiles in Italy and Turkey could mean losing the alliance, and so Robert Kennedy devised a solution to respond only to the first letter. A response was drafted, and the committee edited and approved it. At 7:45 that evening, Robert Kennedy again met with Dobrynin to inform him also of a secret deal. The U.S. would remove its missiles from Italy and Turkey quietly, a few months after the crisis. October 28th. Khrushchev met with a circle of his advisors to discuss the statements from Fomin and Dobrynin. When he discovered that Kennedy would be making a speech later, he assumed the worst. A blockade was already underway, and so he and his advisors drafted a letter, which was immediately rushed to the broadcasting station. The message was received at 9:00 a.m. and agreed to both the secret deal and the public deal. Kennedy almost immediately drafted a response. XCOM halted all flights over Cuba, and Castro was angry that Khrushchev had not consulted him before making the deal. A UN inspection team monitored the removal of the missiles and the demolition of the missile sites in Cuba. The removal of the missiles was just one of the reforms as a result of the crisis. On November 21st, Kennedy formally entered the quarantine of Cuba and lowered the Strategic Command's defense condition from DEFCON 2 to DEFCON 4. The lack of communication between the White House and the Kremlin was also fixed, as it could take up to 7 hours for a message to be transmitted. The reform from this was a hotline between the Kremlin and the White House. Another major reform that came from the crisis was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. In 1963, both nations signed this treaty, which prohibited all test detonations of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis, unfortunately for Khrushchev, led to his downfall. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was removed from power. Another change brought from the crisis is what Ronald Steele writes as a more cooperative policy from Moscow. The crisis also made direct Soviet-American confrontations far less frequent in the time following 1962. The final reform of the crisis would be the survival of the Castro regime. The United States kept up their promise in removing missiles from Italy and Turkey, but also in not invading Cuba. Cuba to this day still remains under the control of the Castro regime. The Castro government, still dedicated to communism, inspires others in the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most crucial events in history, and had it all gone wrong.